Entonces, Frederick es la persona que nos va a guiar en esta sesión que tiene que ver con la normativa de no deforestación. Él es un oficial de Open Trade Case Sweden y tiene bastante experiencia justamente en la elaboración de esta normativa. La presentación de hoy va a ser en inglés, pero todos tenemos la opción abajo en la pantalla de Zoom para hacer la traducción simultánea a español. Por tanto, no hay problema. Si tienen alguna pregunta específica, la pueden escribir en el área de mensajes o la pueden hacer de forma verbal al final de la presentación en español. No hay ningún problema. Tenemos aquí el apoyo de Miguel Aguirre, que nos ayuda con la parte de interpretación. Entonces, cedemos la palabra a Frederick, como les dije en inglés, pero podemos hacer la opción en español. Muchas gracias. Adelante, go ahead, Frederick. Nice to meet you.
Gracias todos. I will continue in English. I hope everyone can hear me. Let's check that first. Great, great. So thank you very much for inviting me. I will try to start my presentation here as well. And I hope the interpreter Miguel will shout at me if I talk too quickly during the presentation. I will try to think about talking quite slowly. So let's just try to share my screen. So can you see the presentation now? I hope so. Great. So my name is Fredrik Gisselman. I work at the National Board of Trade in Sweden as a trade policy advisor focusing on trade and climate and trade and environment. And thank you very much for inviting me to this where I will present an overview of the new EU regulation on deforestation and the implications for Bolivian producers and exporters. It's a quite hard and heavy and technical legislation, so the presentation will be also a bit heavy on the a lot of text on each slide and a lot of information, but I hope that you will understand my main message and the main way that this legislation will work. But we have time for questions in the end. So just a little bit about today's agenda. I will start by just provide a short overview of the legislation, just to give you a sense about what it's all about, and then how it will work more in a little bit more detail. And I have focused on the parts that I think is the most important for producers in Bolivia and third countries. I think the total legislation is around 130 pages long or something, so it's not possible to cover everything, but I hope I cover the main parts. We will then go to a section which I called "How will it affect Bolivian producers and exporters?" and lastly, time for questions. So just to start with this question, what is the EU deforestation regulation? Well, the main objective of this is it's a new EU regulation with the main objective or aim to reduce the EU's global contribution to deforestation and forest degradation. And at the same time, also, of course, then lower the EU's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and loss of biodiversity. And the rationale behind this is that we have seen alarming rates of deforestation globally, and the EU consumption is causing a lot of this because it's EU consumption of certain goods that have driven this development. And the EU sees this as necessary to fulfill its obligations under the Paris Agreement on climate change, Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals in there, and also the Convention on Biological Diversity. So that is like the objective and rationale. And just shortly about the main elements before I go into more detail. So the legislation, when it's in place, it will only allow products that are proven to be both deforestation-free and legal. I will go into more detail in this later. So it's only deforestation-free and legal products that would be allowed to be sold on or exported from the EU market. And all these products also need what is called a due diligence statement. I will go through that in more detail later as well. And the legislation focuses on a couple of commodities or products. It's palm oil, it's soy, it's wood, it's cattle, cocoa, coffee, rubber, and also some derived products or more finished goods made from these. For example, chocolate, furniture, tires, printed products such as books, etc. And the responsibility to ensure compliance with the legislation is and to prove that the products are deforestation free and legal lies on the EU importers and producers and distributors. In this legislation, they are called operators and traders. I might use that term interchangeably during the presentation. And the regulation applies both to products produced within the EU and products produced outside of the EU. So it's the same rules that apply. It's non-discriminatory in that way. It's the same rules for everyone. So in a little bit more detail, how will it work then? So first of all, we have a couple of requirements. So as I said, to be able to sell the products within the EU or export them outside of the EU, from the EU into other countries, these European firms, operators and traders, need to prove that the products are first deforestation free. And they have a specific cut-off date for that. So they are not allowed to have been produced on land that was covered by a forest on the 31st of December 2020. So if you have cut down trees or a forest and have your farm or produce the products on land after that date, you're not allowed to sell them into the EU. And for the category wood or wood products, they are not allowed to have been harvested on land in a way that causes forest degradation. There are specific definitions on both forest degradation, forest, and deforestation free in the legislation. It's quite technical, but it's in the legislation and available to read in more detail. So except for the demands for them to be deforestation free or requirements that they are deforestation free, they also need to be produced in accordance with relevant legislation of the country of production. And they need to be covered by a due diligence statement, as I said earlier. And I will go through these bit by bit and the most important parts. So a little bit more about the product scope. As I said, there's a couple of commodities that are covered, but for all commodities, it's not that every single good is within the scope of the legislation. But for cocoa products, all cocoa products are covered by this legislation. So it's both beans, powder, paste, butter, etc. Everything that's made out of cocoa in this category. And within the language of trade, the HS system, the code system that gives specific codes to different goods, is the entire HS 18, the chapter 18 in the HS system, just to be aware of that. And for coffee products, it's the same. It's all coffee products within a chapter called 0901 in the HS system. So it's both roasted, non-roasted, decaffeinated, etc. Within the other commodity categories, there are only selected products. So not all cattle, oil palm, rubber, soy, and wood products, but quite a few. So before placing the products on the market, the EU firms, operators and traders need to perform a due diligence that include here. Then the collection of the information, I will go through it more in detail later. So for example, data and documents, that's in Article 9 in the legislation if you want to look further at that. They have to make a risk assessment and also perform some kind of risk mitigation actions, which is also specified in Article 11. And I will go through these in more detail now. So if we start by looking at the information requirements, there's a need to provide a description of the product and some inputs as well, if they are within the scope of this legislation. So products contained in the product. So for example, as an example, if you sell a chocolate bar, you also need to provide information about the cocoa within the chocolate bar. You need to provide information about the quantity, the country of production, and maybe the most tricky part here, which is also more new than the other information required, is that you need to provide geolocation, that is latitude and longitude coordinates of all plots where the product and inputs or product contained in the product were produced. And that includes date and time range of production. And if you have used many different plots, you have to provide information of all plots where these commodities have been produced. You also need the EU firms need to provide information about name and postal address of the producer and some kind of proof that the products are deforestation free. It is not entirely clear what type of proof that is, but it's some kind of verifiable information. So it could be some kind of satellite data or maps that show that this area was not covered by a forest before that cutoff date. And also some kind of proof. I say proof because I'm not sure exactly what it is. It's verifiable information that the products have been produced in accordance with relevant national legislation. And I will go further into that later as well. What is relevant national legislation? I hope I'm not talking too fast for the interpreter, but I will keep in mind to not talk too quickly. So, except for the information requirement, the European firms need to make within this due diligence statement a risk assessment as well. So the firms or operators need to perform a risk assessment to establish whether there is a risk that the relevant products are non-compliant. And if there is what they call non-negligible risk, there is a prohibition to place them on the market. You're not allowed if you find a non-negligible risk. I'm not sure the percentage there. Is it 1% risk or 3%? I'm not sure, but that's the term they use in the legislation. And this risk assessment include an analysis of the reliability of the data in the information and documentation. And that should include like the level of corruption in the country, if there's a lack of law enforcement, etc. So they have to do that analysis. They cannot only just accept documentation of data, they also have to review it and assess it. And in specific cases, if there is a non-negligible risk, then if they find that, the European firms shall perform some kind of risk mitigation activities to ensure that they reach a no or only negligible risk. And this includes, for example, collecting additional information and maybe perform independent service or audits, etc., to really ensure that these goods are deforestation free. There are some exceptions to this process, however, for the risk assessment and risk mitigation activities, because the European Commission will establish, when this legislation applies, will establish a 3-tier system that separate countries or parts of countries, that is like different regions, for example, in different risk levels. So that is high, medium, and low risk. And for low-risk countries or regions, the firms in the EU do not need to do the stages of assessment, risk assessment, and mitigation. They still need the information. They need to collect and provide information, but they don't have to do this risk assessment and risk mitigation. And all countries will, by the date of the application of the legislation in 18 months, be assigned a risk category that reflects the risk level in the country or region. And the procedure that is determining which country gets which risk level is specified in Article 29 in the legislation. They're taking into account a lot of information, for example, historical deforestation, the amount of production of these goods, etc. And maybe if your country is part of an international agreement or have bilateral agreements with the EU on deforestation, etc. And just short about the penalties for European firms if they are not complying with the rules. So first of all, you're not allowed to sell these goods if you're not complying with the rules. But if agencies within the EU find that you are not complying with the rules, the EU member states are obliged to introduce effective and proportional penalties. And that includes, for example, fines proportionate to the environmental damage, and that they should be at least 4% of total annual turnover. So it could be quite a lot of money for European firms. It includes confiscation of the products and exclusion from the possibility to engage in public procurement and public funding, and also prohibition from selling the products both within the EU and exports. So I think that European firms will really have to follow these rules and comply with the new legislation with quite hard penalties. So I mentioned it shortly a while ago, but the rules will apply from the end of 2024, so about 18 months from now. And also after 2 years, the EU Commission will review it and see how it works and maybe change different parts. But one thing they will look at if it's going to be expanded to more ecosystems than forest, for example, savanna or wetlands and stuff like that. And also if they're going to expand the product scope, so include more products than what is on the list now. So how will it affect Bolivian producers and exporters then? I hope I had a clear answer on that. It's very difficult. It's a complicated legislation. It's complicated to assess the effects. But first of all, producers in third countries and in Bolivia need to ensure that they produce in accordance with the requirements in the legislation to be able to export to the EU. So, for example, you need to ensure that you are not producing on land that was there where it was a forest before the 31st of December in 2020. Sorry for that. And this also holds for if you want to export to other countries and they in turn export the good to EU. It's the same rules that apply. So for example, say that you export cocoa to Switzerland and they in turn want to make it to a chocolate bar and sell it to the EU. It's the same rules that apply. So the Swiss company will need probably to provide information to the EU importer about where the cocoa was produced and ensure that it was deforestation free. So you need to ensure to not produce or use inputs if they're on the list produced in areas deforested after the 31st of December in 2020. And then also, of course, comply with what they call national relevant legislation. And they are specifying a couple of areas of legislation that is relevant legislation. And that include land use rights, laws on environmental protection and forest management rules, third parties' rights, labor rights, human rights, the principle of free, prior and informed consent, which is set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, tax laws, anti-corruption laws, and trade and custom rules. And that is the national legislation within the producer country. And then, except for just complying and ensuring that you are producing in this way, you also need to provide information because the European firms will need this information and prove that it is deforestation free and compliant with the national laws. So even though the European actors are responsible for the products and are the ones who could face a penalty if they are not complying with legislation. Bolivian and other producers around the world must probably be able to provide information, because European firms won't be able to do that. I'm quite sure about that. So they will probably ask for the information. And some highlights, or I just want to highlight some of the main information that is required as I see it. And that is, of course, the geolocation information, the coordinates, as I mentioned earlier, of all the plots of land where the products were produced, including the inputs, if inputs are on the list, and also verifiable information, in some way a proof that the products are deforestation free. So both the geolocation, where it's produced, and show that this was not a forest before the 31st of December in 2020. So that is the information I'm sure that you need to provide in some way. And then also, of course, some kind of verifiable information that the commodities have been produced in accordance with relevant legislation. And I'm not sure entirely. I have read the legislation, and I have asked people here what type of information that is. It's not entirely clear what is a verifiable and adequate information to show that you have followed all the relevant legislation. So I hope the EU Commission will come out with more information about that soon, but I'm also sure that European companies are thinking about this at the moment to ensure that they can comply. So there's, I call this slide information, information, information. So without information, it is not possible to export to the EU or to other countries that in turn will or want to export these products to the EU. So the main message here is that it's important to get ready, have a look at the legislation. The fastest to adapt will enjoy a comparative advantage here. And we have done a brief analysis about economic and trade effects, but that was earlier during the negotiations of this legislation. But we have seen that this legislation affects import value to the EU of approximately 55 to 65 billion euros annually. And coffee and cocoa are approximately 15 billion euros out of this. And we had a short look at the data yesterday just about the Bolivian exports to the EU. And if the data didn't lie to us, we saw that cocoa exports from Bolivia to the EU was around 2 million euros annually, which represented above 50% of total Bolivian cocoa exports. And for coffee, we saw that it was around 10 million euros annually, and which represented 25% of total Bolivian coffee export. We haven't really scrutinized these numbers, but it was drawn from UN trade statistics. But larger than that, it's quite difficult to assess the trade and economic effects on different countries and producers, because the same rules apply to everyone, all countries in the world, including the EU. So it will, of course, depend on if you are complying with these requirements and how easy it is for you to show it and prove it, and how quickly you can adapt to the information requirements that is needed, and how easy you can provide it. And also, I have read this legislation a couple of times, and I think it's not entirely clear how it will work in practice. So I have read some articles maybe 20 times, and I'm still not entirely sure how it will work between the responsibilities between firms within the EU value chain as well. So I'm not entirely sure how it will work if someone exports, for example, cocoa to the EU, and someone makes that to a paste or something, and someone to make a chocolate bar. If all actors within the EU need this information and do the process again, or if they can rely on previous firms within the EU that they have done it once. That is not entirely clear yet. So because of these uncertainties, it's also hard to analyze if the effects will differ between, for example, small and big producers in Bolivia and in other countries. The EU Commission and also EU member states are ready. They have really expressed that they are ready to work closely with and support partner countries' efforts to promote the transition to sustainable agriculture production and sustainable forest management as well, and the development of transparent and sustainable supply chains. And the EU Commission and some member states will therefore also work with information and inform both countries and firms and businesses with the relevant information to be able to comply with the regulation. There's also been a lot of information sessions for different countries' ambassadors to aimed at explaining the regulation and address questions. There have also been local workshops in third countries to explain the regulation to local officials and different stakeholders. There has been a lot of bilateral meetings at technical and political level, and information and discussion on deforestation and forest degradation and this legislation in multilateral forums, for example, the UN and WTO as well. There's also been discussions in a deforestation platform, which is a forum for interactions and implementation of forest-related questions. And there will probably come more information as well from the EU Commission and also EU member states the coming months, I guess. So I'm going to summarize it with a couple of key takeaways, and then we have quite some time for questions as well, which I hope I can answer. So one of the key takeaways is this legislation will affect trade of all the products covered in the legislation. So there are new rules. They are more far-reaching than we have seen in many areas. So they will affect trade in different ways. It's hard to say how, but it will increase the requirements and information demands from European producers or importers. So the EU importers will need information from producers or maybe exporters. It depends on who has the contact between the countries, I guess. And other countries, including Bolivian producers and exporters, need to prepare for this if they want to continue to sell to the EU, because the rules will apply in 18 months. So it's time to maybe start a discussion with your European and other countries' trading partners to see if they have their eyes on this as well, if they have started analyzing what it could mean and what type of information they think that they need. And also, I think that there might be a need to cooperate with your national agencies as well and see if they can help with documentation and maybe information, data, satellite data, some kind of documentation that show that you are following the relevant legislation, etc. So I think that's like my main point from this presentation. Now you have hopefully got an overview on the requirements, a little bit on how it will work, and also that it's time to start looking at it, this legislation, and start discussing how to comply with it. Gracias todos. And I can take questions, which I hope I can answer some of them.
Yep. I have a question.
Pero muchísimas gracias, Miguel y Frederick. Tal vez puedo traducirle esta pregunta que tenemos. Hay varias preguntas, ¿no? Pero podemos comenzar con Juan Pablo Schul, ¿no? Dice, ¿cómo está en inglés, está en el mensaje, pero cómo garantizar que cómo puede garantizar la Unión Europea la geolocalización que procede de la explotación real en la que se han cosechado, ¿no?, los productos, o que estos han sido producidos en esa área, ¿no? Y tiene otra pregunta también, dice, la Unión Europea está aplicando el blockchain para la trazabilidad. Hay otra pregunta, pero tal vez vamos avanzando. Peter is de
Yeah,
Dinamarca.
can you take the first? Can you
Yeah,
take
yeah.
the first one again? I just heard the second one on blockchain, but not the other one.
Yeah, the first one is very specific. Let me see 1 second, please. How can the EU be assured that geolocalization are from the real farm that the items were harvested, or that all were produced there, that the products were produced there?
Yeah, so maybe we can take one question and then I answer, otherwise I won't remember all of them. But so how the EU can ensure that? So the responsibility is on the EU producers. So there will be controls from agencies and from member state agencies where they will scrutinize the documentation and follow up and have a look at if they actually are produced in those sites that they are saying that they are produced. So, and that is why this due diligence procedure also comes in. So the firms within the EU have to make sure that the documentation, the data, everything is correct. And when the agencies will control the firms and the data, if they find any breaches, they will meet these quite substantial penalties, as I mentioned. So the EU won't really be able to ensure that it comes from exactly these places, but there will be some kind of probably requirement with separate transports of different of harvests from different plots. So you have to, when you harvest some of the products or coca beans, for example, from one site, you have to separate them and show that these are harvested in this specific plot, and then send it to the EU and track it all the way. And it's up to the EU companies to ensure that that's the case. Otherwise, if the agencies within the EU finds any breaches to that, they will meet these penalties. And the question using about the EU using blockchains, that could be absolutely be an alternative. They have not specified how firms will do this. It's open to ideas, to innovations. So they just say you have to show that they are deforestation free and you need this information. But how they do this, it's up to the companies within the EU to find ways. So they haven't chosen a specific technology or way to do this.
Thank you, Frederick. Go ahead, Peter.
Yes, a little bit technical, but the basis of all that we're talking about here. How is a forest being defined?
Yes, that's good. I just have to sneak peek at the documentation. It's they have used a UN definition from FAO and based it on that. So a forest is, let's see here. It's larger than 0.5 hectares and with a canopy cover of, let's see, can't find it.
I think it says at as low as 10% actually.
Yeah.
Which is extremely low.
Yeah, so it's really small areas as well. It's
small areas and only covered with 10% of trees or more.
Yes, so it means land spanning more than 0.5 hectares with trees higher than 5 meters and a canopy cover of more than 10%.
Yeah.
Or trees able to reach these thresholds in situ.
Then how is deforestation being defined?
So that was a very tricky question during the negotiations. So just gonna see how it ended up in the last version. So they are not really defining deforestation, but they define deforestation free.
Okay.
if I remember correctly. Not easy questions you give me. I'm just gonna have to find.
I couldn't find.
Sorry, here I found it now. Deforestation. It was a definition of that. Means the conversion of forest to agricultural use, whether human-induced or not. So it's the conversion from of a forest, which was defined earlier, and then to agricultural use.
Oh, so that includes agroforestry, actually. If you're following that definition, I would have imagined that there would be a certain percentage of removing canopy coverage. Because that means that we cannot grow within forests.
Sorry, you can't.
That means that coffee, just one example, grown within forest in agroforestry cannot be exported then.
Well, I'm not entirely sure about that. As I said, I have been analyzing this mainly from like an economic and trade perspective, and we have had experts on forests and definitions and exactly more the ecological point on this. And I think that they have a definition also on agricultural use.
Okay.
And so it means the use of land for the purpose of agriculture, including for agricultural plantations and set aside agricultural areas. And then they have a definition of agricultural plantations as well. So it might be worth looking at these definitions as well. And I know this legislation is available in Spanish as well. So it's possible for everyone to have a look at it.
Where can we find it? This part of the details we're talking about here.
Yeah, so the definitions is in Article 2. So a lot of the main information is in the first 10 articles, I would say, which are mostly focusing on what the firms should do or the information. Then it's more about process and stuff late in the latter parts and the risk assessment, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Excelente, muchísimas gracias, Frederick. Thank you very much, Peter. Tenemos una pregunta de Marcela Montán. Pregunta, ¿cómo se completa el nuevo reglamento 2018-848 al reglamento de productos libres de deforestación? El reglamento de productos libres de deforestación ya está aprobado y disponible en la legislación de la Unión Europea. Pregunta.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I entirely understood, but I think so. If you mean the old timber regulation, if that's the one you are referring to, or is it something else?
Sí, es. Ya. Sí, la pregunta es si el nuevo reglamento de deforestación se complementa con el que ya existe, ¿no? Con el de libre deforestación.
Yes, I think this legislation is entirely not connected to that one at all, as I see it. So this is rather focusing. It's an update and expansion of a legislation called the timber regulation before. So it's not connected to that 2018-848. So it's rather replacing and also expanding the previous timber regulation within the EU.
Excelente. Muchísimas gracias. Tenemos una pregunta más de Luz Rocha. Dice, ¿qué oportunidades de mercado puede generar la Unión Europea para la industria soyera, para que éstas puedan exportar derivados de soya libres de deforestación? ¿Qué tipo de incentivos puede generar y brindar a toda la cadena productiva de soya, desde los agricultores hasta los exportadores?
Yeah, let's see if I understand it entirely as well. But so previously, for example, there has been different legislations that are affecting soy production or soy imports, but now this one is not possible anymore to sell soy products to the EU if they cannot prove that they are deforestation free. So I guess there's no other incentives that I know about except for just complying with the law. I'm not sure if I understood exactly the question.
Y esta pregunta de Miguel Jorge Villavicencio, does this apply to the Brazilian castaña? Yeah.
Yeah.
Castañas de Brazil is definitely not included.
No, they are not part of the scope of this legislation.
Super, muchísimas gracias. Hemos abordado todas las preguntas por ahora. Sí. Si tienen otras preguntas, tienen el correo electrónico mío, lo pueden enviar. Es ariel.miranda@swisscontact.org y vamos a transferir las preguntas a Frederick. Entonces concluimos la sesión agradeciendo a Frederick, a la Embajada de Suecia, a los colegas de Open Trade Gate Sweden